Today I want to share with you how to make homemade flaked cereal, so you'll never have to buy boxed cereal again. Hi sweet friends, I'm Mary and welcome to Mary's Nest, where I teach traditional cooking skills for making nutrient-dense foods like bone broth, ferment, sourdough, and more. So if you enjoy learning about those things, consider subscribing to my channel and don't forget to click on the little notification bell below. That'll let you know every time I upload a new video. It's actually very easy to make homemade flake cereal, but why would we want to when there's such a huge selection at the grocery store of boxed flake cereals? The reason is, number one, boxed flake cereals can be a little on the expensive side for the amount that you get compared to how much you can make homemade for a lot less. But the second reason is what really is the most important reason. And that reason is the fact that when flaked cereal is made, it goes through a process called extrusion. And what happens during this extrusion process is that the proteins in the wheat or whatever whole grain is being used to make the flake cereal become damaged. And these damaged proteins can possibly have a negative effect on our nervous system. But the nice thing about making a homemade flaked cereal is that we don't go through the extrusion process, so it's a lot healthier for us. So what do we need to make our homemade flake cereal? The first thing that you're going to need is your whole grain flour. But don't worry about writing any of this down, because if you open the description under this video, there'll be a link, it'll say recipe, and if you click on that, it'll take you over to the printable recipe. Now I'm using 6 cups of whole wheat flour. And the reason I'm using whole wheat flour is that's a very easy flour to find at most grocery stores. But if you're farther along on your journey, leaving a processed foods kitchen behind and traveling to developing a traditional foods kitchen, and you've incorporated more whole grains, and specifically ancient whole grains, into your cooking, you can certainly use einkorn flour, the whole grain einkorn flour, or whole grain spelt flour. Any of those will work. And you can even use sprouted flour to make this homemade flake cereal if you've already started incorporating sprouted flour into your baking. And if you're interested in learning more about sprouted flour, I have a video where I show you how to make homemade sprouted flour. And I'll be sure to link to that in the iCards and in the description below. And the nice thing about using sprouted flour to make homemade flake cereal actually allows you to skip over one step, which I'll discuss as we go forward in this. So I've got my 6 cups of whole wheat flour. And the next thing that you're going to need is 2 cups of milk and 2 cups of yogurt. And this is whole milk and this is whole milk yogurt. Now this is the combination that I like, but you can use different combinations to create the liquid that you need to add to your whole wheat flour or whatever whole grain flour that you're using. If you have access to raw milk, you can definitely use raw milk. And you could even use maybe 3 3/4 cups of raw milk and then maybe a 1/4 cup of whey. Or if you don't have any milk, but you do have yogurt, you'll still use the 2 cups of yogurt, and then you can use 2 cups of water just to thin the yogurt. But if you want to keep this dairy-free, you can do that. You can use all water or you could use all juice. Any type of juice that you like an apple juice might work very well because it's light in color, but you will also need to add some type of acidic medium. So to the water or juice that you're using, you'll want to add in some fresh lemon juice or some raw apple cider vinegar. And I'll have all the different variations in the written recipe. And the reason that you need something acidic, whether it's the yogurt or the whey or some lemon juice or some raw apple cider vinegar, is because that's what's going to help deactivate the phytic acid. Now I just want to take a minute to talk about phytic acid, but if you already know all about it and you want to just jump ahead to where we go ahead and make the cereal, be sure to check the description below where I'll have the timestamps. Now, if you're new to traditional foods cooking, you may be wondering, what is phytic acid and why do we need to deactivate it? Phytic acid is something that's contained in grains as well as other foods as well. And it actually has a good side and a bad side. The good side is that it's an antioxidant, which scientists tell us can help prevent disease. The bad side is that it can strip nutrients from our body, or it can prevent us from absorbing certain nutrients. And the reason that we want to try to deactivate some of it is so that we don't strip nutrients from our body, as well as we want to be able to absorb the nutrients that are in the food that we're eating. The good news is that when you soak or sprout or sour, as in sourdough bread, any food that contains phytic acid, it neutralizes some of the phytic acid, but not all of it. So in a way, it's interesting the way nature has provided for us in that we can deactivate some of the phytic acid so as to not strip too many nutrients out of our body and allow us to absorb the nutrients that we do want to absorb from our food. Yet at the same time, we still can get the antioxidant benefits that phytic acid offers. Now, in addition to our 6 cups of flour, our 2 cups of milk, and our 2 cups of yogurt, we're also going to want some flavoring. And I like to add cinnamon. And I've just got a teaspoon of cinnamon here. But you really can add anything you want, or you can leave it out. And then you're also going to want to add a teaspoon of salt. And this is just a fine ground sea salt, but you can use whatever you have. And next you're going to want a teaspoon of vanilla. And this is just a homemade vanilla, but you can use whatever you have. But if that's something that you're interested in learning how to make, I've got a video where I show you how to do that, and I'll be sure to link to it in the iCards and in the description below. And one more thing that you're going to need, which you add at the very end of this process, is a half a stick of melted butter. And that's 1/4 cup of melted butter. But again, if you're trying to keep this dairy-free, you can definitely use 1/4 cup of coconut oil or other mild-flavored oil that you like working with. The first thing we're going to do is just go ahead and sprinkle our little bit of dry ingredients into our flour. So I've got my cinnamon in there, and now I've got my salt, and I'm just going to go ahead and whisk this together just to make sure that the cinnamon and the salt are well distributed throughout the flour. Next, we're going to go ahead and add our teaspoon of vanilla to our milk. And now we'll go ahead and add in our 2 cups of yogurt into our milk and vanilla mixture. And next, we're just going to whisk this all together until it's nice and smooth. And I'm just using this little whisk. I don't know if you've ever tried one of these. They are great. It's called the Magic Whisk, and they are just fantastic for whenever you're mixing something like this, like a yogurt or something that's liquidy, like mixing eggs. I just love it. Be sure to look for this. They're very inexpensive, and for something so small, it really does a great job. So be sure to look for it in the kitchen aisle, at your grocery store. I think they're pretty common. But I'll also put a link in the description below. I just found mine on Amazon. As I said, they're just a couple of dollars, and they're really great. Alrighty, now once that's all mixed and you don't have any lumps from the yogurt, we're going to go ahead and pour this right into our I had to think about it, right into our whole wheat mixture. Then at this stage, all we're going to do is just take a spatula or a wooden spoon, whatever you have, and just start incorporating all of the wet ingredients in with the dry until you form a nice dough. And basically I just keep mixing this until all of the flour is incorporated. And at some point, if it just starts to become a little dry and you can't keep mixing it with your spatula or your wooden spoon, what I like to do is just get in with a nice clean hand and just start mixing it the way you would, say, if you were doing bread dough. And basically all you want to do is just keep moving it around the bowl until you picked up all the flour and there's no dry flour left. It's all incorporated and you've made this into a nice dough. Once you've got everything mixed, the next thing that you're going to do is take a piece of plastic wrap and you're going to cover your bowl. Now you're just going to want to put this in a cozy place in your kitchen, undisturbed and out of direct sunlight, and basically let it sit at room temperature overnight or for about 8 to 12 hours. Now, if you're new to making traditional foods and leaving something like this on your counter overnight makes you nervous, you can certainly put this in the refrigerator. You'll just want to let it sit in your refrigerator a little longer than the 8 to 12 hours to give it a little more time in cold conditions to work at deactivating some of the phytic acid. And now, if you've made this with sprouted flour, you don't need to go through the overnight soak process. And the reason is because the sprouted flour has already deactivated some of the phytic acid. So you'll be able to move on right to the next step where we actually start making the cereal. But I know that I have heard from some of you who bake a lot with sprouted flour that you do still like to go through the soaking process to try and deactivate even more phytic acid. And if that's something that you want to do, you can certainly proceed just like we are with the regular flour. Now, this is another one I have that's all ready that I let soak overnight. And I'll just remove this lid and I'll show you exactly what it looks like. Now we're going to go ahead and pour our butter over the top, or coconut oil. You could also use ghee or avocado oil is pretty mild, you know, whatever you want to use. But a little fat really helps this tremendously. Now all we're going to do is just work this in to our dough here. And you just want to keep working the butter or the coconut oil, whatever you're using, into your dough. It takes about 30 seconds or so to the point where it's completely incorporated and you don't see any more of the melted fat pooling down in the bottom of your bowl. And once you've got all of your fat incorporated, your dough should look just like this. Now at this point, you can use parchment paper or you can use wax paper, or if you don't have either of those, what you'll want to do is get your baking sheet. I'm going to use 2 half-size baking sheets, and you'll want to just grease it with whatever fat that you're using. Now, if you're using parchment paper, you'll be able to transfer that right to your baking sheet, and you can put that in your oven. You don't need to worry. If you're using wax paper, you'll want to peel the wax paper off and then put it onto your greased baking sheet. If you're just going to do this right on a greased baking sheet, then you can do that too. You would put your dough right on here and roll it out real thin right on your baking sheet. But what we're going to do is we're going to cut our dough in half. We just want to get about a half portion. And if you have one of these little plastic bench scrapes, they work great for this job. But if not, don't worry. You can easily just do this with your hand. Now, if you're using the parchment paper, you're going to go ahead and cover this portion of your dough that you've got on your first piece of parchment paper. And if you're using wax paper, you'll do the same thing. If you have neither and you're just going to be rolling this out and for flattening it out, you can even just flatten it out with your hand on your greased baking sheet. I recommend that you grease your rolling pin or your hands. Now all we're going to do is just start rolling out our dough until we get it very thin, basically the size of our baking sheet. Now once you get this all rolled out nice and thin, about 1/8 of an inch, you know, the thinner the better, then you're just going to want to pull off your parchment paper or wax paper, whatever you're using. If you've done it right on your baking sheet, you don't need to worry about this. And as you're pulling it off, if for any reason it sticks, you can just dip your fingers in a little bit of water and just kind of help it along, and it'll loosen up very easily. Next, you're just going to slide this right onto your baking sheet. Now we're going to put this into a preheated oven that's been set at 300 degrees Fahrenheit. And we're going to bake this for somewhere between 45 minutes to an hour. We basically want it to be very dry. Now when you're doing this at home, you can do one right after the other and then put them both in the oven to bake at the same time. You'll just have 2 racks in your oven. And then halfway through the baking time, you'll want to take the baking pan that's on the top rack and put that down on the bottom rack, and take the baking pan that's on the lower rack and put that up on the top rack. Now, while my first baking sheet of homemade flake cereal is baking, I want to talk about sweeteners. The first batch that I made, which is in the oven now, that I let soak overnight, is made with a sweetener. And the batch that we made today, which is sitting on the back counter, is not made with a sweetener because I wanted to make one that was a sweetened cereal and one that was an unsweetened flake cereal. If you want to make a sweetened flake cereal like my first batch, you'll want to add your sweetener at the phase where you're mixing your milk and your yogurt together. And at that point, you'll add in your sweetener. I used a half a cup of maple syrup. You could also use a half a cup of honey. Or you could use molasses. If you use molasses, you'll want to use a little less because the flavor is stronger. With molasses, you'll probably want to use about a quarter or a third of a cup. If you want to use a dry sweetener, like a sucanat or maple sugar or coconut sugar or date sugar, in order to get the same level of sweetness that you would get with like a half a cup of honey or a half a cup of maple syrup, you'll probably want to use 3/4 to 1 cup of the dry sweetener. But the amount of sweetness is really a matter of personal taste, and it's one of those things that you're going to want to experiment with, and also leaving it out as well. And then when you actually eat the flake cereal with your milk, you can decide if you want to put some sweetener in at that point, drizzling a little honey on top or a little maple syrup or a little sprinkle of sucanat. It's really up to you. And that's why I wanted to talk about making one batch without sweetener over there and one batch with sweetener here. And after you make your first batch with or without sweetener, you're going to start to get a feel for what you like. And if you do use sweetener, you'll get a feel for how much sweetener that you want to add. And for those of you who I know will ask me this, can you use one of the no-cal sweeteners? Can you use stevia? Can you use allulose? Can you use one of the monk fruit erythritol mixes? And yes, you can. And again, it's just going to be a matter of how they compare. Are they a 1-to-1 with regular sweeteners? Are they a few drops like with stevia compared to a full cup of a whole sugar? And so on and so forth. And again, it's going to all come down to what taste you like. So the first time you make this, you'll get a feel for, okay, I want to make it a little sweeter next time. Or gee, next time maybe I'm going to make it completely unsweetened and then put my sweetener on when I go to eat it. So you have a lot of options available to you when it comes to sweetening this dough. And one other thing I want to mention about using sweeteners in making this cereal is that if you do decide to use one of the dry sweeteners, like a sucanat or maple sugar, so on and so forth, you'll want to go ahead and mix that right in with your milk and yogurt mixture, or just your milk mixture, or your water and your other form of acid like a lemon juice or an apple cider vinegar, whatever liquid you're using. I find that dissolving the sweetener in the liquid that you're using works better, even when it's a dry sweetener, works better than if you just put your sweetener right in, if you're using a dry sweetener, just putting it right in with your flour. It works better if you go ahead, whatever your sweetener you're using, whether it's a liquid honey, maple syrup, or a dry sugar like a sucanat or coconut sugar, so on and so forth, mix it in with your wet ingredients before you add it into your flour. Well, I checked on this at 45 minutes, but it still needed some more time to bake. So I baked it for a little over an hour. And you'll want to do the same. You'll want to check it at 45 minutes and then see how much longer you're going to need to bake it. And the reason is everyone's oven is different, and depending on how thin you've rolled your dough might be slightly different than how thin I rolled my dough. And you'll know that your dough is ready, which is now going to be turned into your cereal, when you can tap on it and it has that very hard, hollow sound. And it's going to be very crisp and it's going to break easily, as you can see this piece did. And as I was allowing this to cool and just kind of moving it around a little on the parchment paper, it was also cracking at various seams that had developed when I was rolling it out with my rolling pin. So that's how you'll know that it's done. It'll be hard and hollow sounding, and it'll be quite crisp. And even though it may start cracking even while it's warm, as you move it around on your parchment paper, allowing it to cool, once it's completely cool, it's going to be very crisp, and you're going to be able to just start breaking it into little pieces. See that? And as you start to break it up, you'll have these little chips that are now your homemade flaked cereal. And if you want to just make the job very easy, you can just cover this whole thing with parchment paper and then take your rolling pin and just roll over it a couple of times, and that'll break it up into a lot of little pieces. Now, once you've got all your cereal baked up and broken into little pieces, you want to store it in some type of airtight container. A large jar with a screw-on lid will be great. A plastic container with snap-down lid will be great. Anything like that will work. And it'll stay fresh in your pantry for about 3 to 4 weeks, but I think you'll eat it before that. Now, I wanted to put a little bit of cereal in a separate bowl here and put some milk on it to show you exactly how nice it works out as a homemade flake cereal. And first, I just want to take one of these and bite into it so that you can hear, I hope you can hear the crunch. I hope you could hear that on the mic. Oh, sorry. But yeah, even if you snap them in half, you can really hear that. It really turns out nice. And then you can just go ahead and pour some milk right onto this. Mix it up like this. You can give it a minute or two to soften if you like it a little on the softer side. And it works very well, just as if you may have poured it from a box. Very tasty. Now, if you'd like to learn how to make more homemade traditional foods, be sure to click on this video over here, where I show you how to make the vanilla extract we used in this recipe, along with 9 other homemade flavored extracts. I also show you how to make apple cider vinegar, cottage cheese, and all sorts of things. And I'll see you over there in my Texas Hill Country Kitchen. Love and God bless.